Hi, I'm Ian Griffiths, and this is a talk in the Building Business Applications for Silverlight series. In this talk, we're going to look at how to print output from your applications. So in the context of our example application, users are able to build a schedule for their visit for a particular event. So they might have planned to go to a particular event, they can pick the talks they'd like to go to, and in an earlier talk we showed how to let them build up that list and show it on the screen. Now obviously it would be nice for them to be able to print that out so they can bring it with them, so they don't have to keep opening up a laptop to work out where they're going to go next. So we're going to look at the printing services in Silverlight. Now actually for the demos for this particular section, I'm going to show them in isolation from the main application, because obviously we're building on top of things like RIA services, but printing is far more general purpose. So I'm going to show you the basic structure for printing rather than the specifics for our particular application, because the principles apply everywhere. So we're going to look at the printing services in Silverlight. We're also going to take a quick look at the ViewBox class that's added in Silverlight 4 because it's a useful thing when you're printing things out. So, printing is a fairly straightforward process. This slide shows the entire outline, in fact. All you have to do is this. Create a print document object. Attach a handler to its print page event and then call its print method. When you call print, it will start raising the print page event, and in your handler you have to provide the visuals you'd like to have printed. You supply any object that derives from UI element, so in practice any kind of user interface element will do in Silverlight, and you give that to the page event args, and you also say whether you'd like it to carry on printing. Have you got more pages to print? If you do, you can set the has more pages property to true and it will raise the event again, and you get to provide a second visual. And you basically keep going until you've printed all the stuff you wish to print. The print method that kicks this off on the print document only works if you're inside an input handler. You're not allowed to call it asynchronously. You can't suddenly start shoving stuff off to the printer without the user's consent. In any case, they're going to show the print dialog as soon as you call it, so you can't surreptitiously print things anyway. But you're required to do that inside of an input handler. Like a lot of things in Silverlight, it's a thing that can only be done if the user happens to be interacting with your application right now. So, the simplest way of doing this is to print something that's already in your user interface. So you might say, well, I've got a UI here, I've got some stuff on the screen, and I just want to send that directly to the printer, and that's all I'd like to do. And this will work. This works just fine. The print page event will happily take any UI element, including one that is already participating in some UI on the screen. You don't have to build something specially just to print. However, as we're about to see, that's not necessarily a brilliant thing to do. If you print something on screen, it will appear exactly as it is on screen. It will be as wide as it is right now. And that may be wider than your paper, in which case it'll crop the output. Or it might be a lot narrower than your sheet of paper, in which case it just won't fill the page. Also, if you show a UI element on the screen, there are elements that might not make sense on paper. If you show, for example, a list box, it might have scroll bars to make things fit on the screen. And that makes sense on the screen because the user can interact with the scroll bars. Printing scroll bars out on paper is a less useful thing to do because the user can't drag them. They'll just see a picture of a scroll bar on a sheet of paper. What are you supposed to do with that? So that's the downside of printing stuff that is literally on the screen is it gives you an exact copy of what's already there. It is essentially equivalent to hitting the print screen button, which grabs a bitmap screenshot of what's on the screen and just gives you that. However, sometimes those limitations are acceptable, sometimes that's all that you want, so that's the simplest thing we can do. So let's start there. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio here. I've already built a little application to start with. And if I run this, you can see what it does is it basically shows a list box containing every named color in Silverlight's System Colors collection. So there's a System Colors class, and the code for this, if we go and look at the code behind, in my main page, I just write a link query which asks the reflection system to get all the public properties available in the System Colors class. It then retrieves the value, assumes it's going to get a color back, which will be true in this case, and constructs an instance of a little type I've written called color info. Here it is, just contains the name, the color value itself, and also a brush of that color so we can paint stuff in the UI. And then I'm just using data binding. I've got a user control here, which contains, let me get that out of the way, that contains a border whose background is bound to that brush. And then a couple of text blocks, one bound to the actual color value, and that's what prints out that hash hexadecimal color code, and then one that prints out the name. So I'm using ordinary data binding to show this stuff. So obviously a list of colours is not terribly realistic, but having a list box with a series of items whose contents have come from data binding is exactly the sort of thing you're likely to want to print all the time. So let's add some code to our main page to print this out. Obviously the first thing I'll need is some sort of button I can click on to actually kick off the printing process. So let's make a bit of space. I'm going to shrink my list box down a bit there, and I'm going to add a button to the user interface to kick off the printing process. So let's just move that up there. Let's call that print button. Label that print and add a handler. So remember, the steps of printing are, number one, create yourself a print document, and this lives in the system.windows.printing namespace. And then attach a handler to its print page event. And I'm going to do this just as an inline method using a lambda. And we'll kick off the print document process by calling the print method on the print document. And then inside my print page event handler, I simply have to supply a user interface element that I'd like it to print. So let's use that existing list box, color list dot, just color list is going to be my whole visual. So I'm going to set the page, the print event args, set its page visual to be the color list. Notice the event args gives us some information. It provides us with, if I just open that again, it provides us with information like the page margins, how much space there is between the page and the printable area, and how big the printable area is. For now, we're ignoring that because we're just going to print what's on the screen already. And that's all there is to it. I just connect an existing control into the print system, and away we go. So let's run this. I'm going to click print. Now, I don't actually have a physical printer in the room. That's some printer in a machine in a building. I don't even know where that is. So I'm actually going to use the Microsoft XPS Document Writer print target. And that's going to print virtually to a file on disk, and we can then open that up and take a look at it to see how the print output appears. So I click print, it's going to raise the print event, and immediately what happens here is I get asked where do I want to save the XPS file. This is a feature of the XPS printer, by the way. This has nothing to do with Silverlight. This is just because I've chosen to print to a virtual print device, which is going to save my output to a file rather than sending it to a physical printer. You'd see a similar thing if you're printing to, for example, Adobe's PDF writer. So I'm going to save this out into the demo directory I'm using here. So let's call this printdemo.xps. And it will grind away for a few seconds, and then it's done. I've not written any code to provide any feedback, so I just happen to wait until it's finished. And here in that folder is the XPS file. Let's open that up. And the XPS viewer appears. Let's zoom out a little bit. So there's my whole sheet of paper, and it's not done a brilliant job of positioning the content on the page. It's done exactly what I asked it to do. I said, please print what's on screen. It's gone, okay, I'll print what's on screen. Scroll bars and all. Obviously, we're looking at it on screen right now, but this is just XPS. It's just like a fixed document viewer. It's like PDF. It's a fixed document format. It's not interactive. It is just an image. It's exactly what you'd see if you printed this thing onto the page. So that's not terribly useful. And obviously, if I do this again and deliberately mess with the layout, so if I find the right browser window, if I make it a bit bigger and lose the scroll bar and print again, and just overwrite that existing document and go back to the same demo directory and open that one more time. Well, I've lost the scroll bars, but it's still not filling the whole page. It's basically taking the browser dimensions. And obviously you can easily get yourself into a situation where your browser window is wider than your paper, at which point it will just start to crop the content, which again is not terribly useful. So while this is the simplest thing you can do, it's probably a little bit too simple to be strictly useful. So we're going to have to do a bit more work than this for most scenarios. In practice, most of the time when you print, you are going to want to build a visual tree specifically for the purposes of printing. This doesn't mean you can't reuse your existing XAML. I'm going to use that user control I showed you with all those data binding expressions. So the main core of my UI is going to come from the same place. I'm just going to combine it together a little bit differently so that I can get a layout that will definitely fit on the page. And I'm going to use the printable area property that is provided to me by the page layout to work out how big things are going to be. And actually, I'm also going to use the viewbox element to make sure things fit. Because it turns out that my content, the list of colors I'm showing at the size I'm showing it, is ever so slightly larger than a typical sheet of paper. And so it's not quite going to fit without being squeezed a little bit. So for this example, I'm going to force it to fit on one page by just reducing it a bit by using the viewbox. So let's do that. So rather than just taking my color list, let's do this. Let's build. Oops, let's stop running first of all. I'm going to build an items control. Items control is the base class of listbox. It does all the same item generation and data binding features, but it doesn't provide the scroll bars by default, and it doesn't provide the selection selectability. And I don't want either of those features for printing. I don't want to have selection highlights. I don't want, if the mouse happened to be over an item just as I wanted to print it, I don't want the item to be lit up on page. Items control gives me the plain item list generation that I require, and so I can do this. Build one of those. Set the item source just like I did with the control in my main UI, so that to be the items collection. Remember, this items collection is just a list of color info objects I'm populating up here. And I need to give this thing a data template as its item template property. And I'm actually going to reuse the same one that I'm already using on my main UI. So here in my main page.xaml, I've already got a data template. I'm just going to move that up into a resources section so I can share it across this list box and the item control I'm using for printing. So I'm going to add to my root element here, I'm going to add a resources section. I'm going to paste that data template in, give it a name, call it print item template, and make that the value of my list box's item template here. So resource reference, and then I can use the same resource in the code behind. So I come over here and say this item host dot item template equals the exact same template object. If I make that the page visual, we're almost there. If I just run this now, click print, again select the XPS document writer, and I've done something wrong. Oh no, there we are. Again, overwrite that, replace that, and one more time we're going to take a look at that. So you can see it's now printing out all my items. It's going to go all the way to the bottom of the page now because we've no longer got these constraints being imposed by how big the control happened to be on the page. However, you can see it's getting cropped. It's not going all the way to the end here, and actually there are more items than this. If I go back to the main UI, that control text color, it's not the last one. There's more further down, so it's not all fitting in. So this doesn't fit on one single page, but we can deal with this. One way of handling this is simply to wrap the items host in a viewbox. A viewbox, new feature in Silverlight 4, basically is able to stretch any user interface element to fit the available space. So we're going to say, please take my items host and make it fit, and we're going to use the squashed content as the page visual. I'm also going to tell this thing I only want it to stretch in the downward direction. In other words, if I have less content than is required to fill the page, I'm going to say just show it its natural size. If I have too much content, then and only then are we going to stretch it down, squash it down to make it fit. So with this in place, I can run again, I can print again, same process as before, overwrite the output, and let's go and take a look at the results. everything now fits. Obviously it's smaller because it's shrunk it down to fit, but that's what I wanted. So if I want to go for a single page of output, then I can just use the view box to make things fit. Now obviously you might say, well, I'd like to go for multiple pages, but that's a more complex process, and we're going to talk about that in a later talk in the series. For single pages of print, it's a fairly simple thing to do. You create the print document, you attach a handler to the print page. In the print page, you generate the visual tree you're going to use. So you create some content specially for rendering to the printer, possibly using existing controls and existing templates like I did. And then when you're ready to go, you call the print method and it kicks off the print process. And that's it.